This chapter was a big chapter. It covers a lot of ground. Could easily been divided into two chapters. But there's a lot of reasons to kind of connect the two, particularly management and some of the ecology. If I were to think of 2 or 3 to really take-home points from this chapter, it would be certainly number 1, old growth, of course, which is the main focus of the Northwest Forest Plan. There's more than one kind of old growth, big surprise. We were fairly narrowly focused in the Northwest Forest Plan on the dense multi-story old growth, but if you look across the region carefully, you see that there's a wide range of old growth, with the open old growth, of course, being quite a different type. And so that's a real critical thing to consider when moving forward with something related to old growth conservation in the Pacific Northwest. The other key point is conservation of biodiversity in the Pacific Northwest is more than old growth. There are other successional stages that are critical. Old growth is part of a dynamic system, and anywhere from early successional stages following fire to partially burned stages to early young forest conditions to hardwoods, all important to the mosaic and the diversity of the landscape. And the third, I think, which really comes home with the previous talk, is that history can be a guide, but we can't go back. We can't reconstruct these ecosystems or return them to the past. We can approximate some of that. We can use the past as a rough reference, but there's no going back. The climate's changing, and climate is a huge driver of what these ecosystems are and where the species are. So those are all, I would say, three important points to keep in mind when thinking about the vegetation and specifically the old growth emphasis that the Northwest Forest Plan had. So, of course, the Northwest Forest Plan emphasis is colored very strongly by the previous 22 or 3 or 4 decades leading up to 1990. And that was the decades, as was alluded to before, of great timber harvesting and emphasis on producing wood from national forests. Of course, there was multiple use was always in there. But as you all know, timber production was the big driver of a lot of what happened in the national forests, and a big driver of the concern over threats to the old growth. And so when the scientists got together in the Pink Tower in 1993, that was foremost on our mind as to what was that timber driving element and what was the threat to species and ecosystems. And so a lot of the emphasis of the Northwest Forest Plan design was thinking about the threat from logging and clear cutting of old growth forests. And of course that changed the landscape, it changed the old growth, moving it from the multi-story complex systems to short rotations. I think the National Forest would be perhaps thinking about something in the order of 80 rotation, which is quite a bit shorter than a 400 to 600 natural year rotation that you would have got fire, particularly in some of the moist forests. The great thing that we had, one of the great resources that we had when we put the synthesis together, was the monitoring reports. And the monitoring was absolutely essential to our understanding of what went on, what was working, what was not working, where things were going. And I would say that perhaps no other region in the world had such an outstanding monitoring and database system to operate from. That really helped us out because, as you know, everyone's got a million ideas about what's going on in the national forests across the landscape. And only if you collect data and plots or use remote sensing can you really actually narrow down what is really going on. And so what we were able to do from the monitoring, and we highlight this in this chapter and other places, is determine that there's 6 to 12 million acres of old growth, depending on how you define it. So if you define it narrowly, the classic calendar old growth, the big Douglas firs and the western hemlocks, is probably around 6 million acres. If we define it more broadly to bring in these other age classes that for most people in the world would still be old growth because the trees are large or the forest has never been harvested, we probably have something like 12 million acres, which is roughly half the Northwest Forest Plan area, which fits when you think about it. We were logging the national forest in an 80-year rotation. We went through 40 years of that. We basically went through about 40 to 50% of the landscape, and the rest of the landscape was in a fairly natural state. So there's still a significant amount of, quote, unlogged or relatively natural forest out there. So the monitoring told us that during the 20 years of the monitoring of the Northwest Forest plans, there were gains and losses. Many of the losses to fire were expected. We sat down, we estimated, okay, we knew fire was going to happen. We just didn't know in the early 90s what the climate trend was, how rapidly that climate trend was going to drive fire, but it certainly brought fire into the picture a lot more than then. But at the time, we estimated there would be losses to fire, and actually the losses to fire that we experienced in the intervening period were about what we estimated. I would chalk that up to being lucky, because we were pretty much guessing at that time. So we didn't have any fancy models. We sat down literally with a few folks and had some envelopes, and we kind of wrote things out in the back of an envelope and said, oh, this looks pretty good. Let's put that number in there. So this is kind of secrets for how science operates sometimes. But the losses are regionally variable. If you look at this map here, you can see this is all the LSRs. These are the big reserves in the Northwest Forest Plan area. I think folks outside the room can't see this, but the blobs here, either gray or red or blue, are individual LSRs. If they're red, that means there's been some loss. If they're blue, that means there's been some gain. So we've had some losses, like down here in the Southern Cascades, certainly down here in parts of Northern California, where the dark red means more than 10% loss in that particular LSR. But there's been some blues in there. The Coast Range has actually been some increase in the amount of old forest in coastal areas. Some of these small LSRs down here, even a few up here. And then most of the LSRs are gray. They haven't changed all that much. So as you can expect during a 23-year period, there's some winners and losers. And then if we look at where there's been a lot of change, either plus or minus change, that's where the pie charts come in. And so you can see here that this LSR was almost a 50% loss up in the North Cascades, another 50% loss down in southwestern Oregon. So there's been some areas where 50% of the old forest in an LSR has been lost or converted to wildfire. But then actually some of these small LSRs actually have shown, fairly large gains. So the change has been a variable, and it's a function of the size. So it's not all a single direction. But overall, there's been a small net decline in the amount of old forest. And again, that wouldn't necessarily be a surprise, because if you think about it, there's some age class discrepancies, and it's going to take a long time for those 40 or 50 or 60-year-old forests that were plantations back in the 90s to grow 100 years or whatever it takes. So there's going to be some lags in the change. This illustrates the amount of change in an LSR as a function of the size of the LSR. And so the blue dots above are individual LSRs, and this is area down here. So some LSRs are quite large, 200,000 acres way over here. Others are relatively small, less than 10,000 acres. So there's a range of size in LSRs. And this is quite relevant to thinking about what to do about reserves in the future, because small reserves have a different capacity than large reserves. What we found, of course, from the monitoring data is that, there's a tendency for more change, either gain or loss, in the small LSRs. That shouldn't be a big surprise. Bigger LSRs tend to be able to absorb a big fire, even if it punches out a few thousand acres of old forest. And so that's another consideration for future design of reserves. All old growth is not the same. When the Northwest Forest Plan was implemented and designed, we were focused on the upper left hand side here. This classic calendar Sierra Club, multi-storied old growth Douglas fir over multi-storied hemlock, the great stuff you see on the Mount Hood or the little pieces of the Coast Range or up on the Gifford Pinchot. That's this great stuff here. And yet, if we look carefully, and what the science has demonstrated over time, is that there's actually more than four, but I'm just illustrating four here. If we look again, say on the moist forest, there's another type of old growth down in the lower left. This is an old growth where there was a fire about 100 years ago, and it thinned out the hemlocks, left an overstory of big Douglas firs, but created a very different, almost kind of a single layer or two-layer forest. That was very common in the southern Cascades, in the southern part of the Willamette, some of the Umpqua National Forest, had these partial burns that periodically went through the old growth. So if your target is this moist multi-layer old growth, that may not be what that landscape had historically, the defensive guiding point. Of course, the other old growth that we often think about is the dry forest, which occupy about 40% of the Northwest Forest Plan area. The classic open ponderosa pine forest here. This is an example of one that was burned recently, and those were fairly open. Of course, they were burned within 10 to 20 years historically. But today, most of these look like this, where there's a lot of infilling. So these are both old growth. These are all old growth. Our definitions tend to emphasize the upper left. This is one of the recommendations we have in the synthesis, is that we consider broadening and using more nuanced definitions of old growth to actually figure out where we are in the landscape, and not apply this upper left standard to all of these different types of forests. So we need new definitions for many of the old growth types, particularly in the dry forests. One of the major efforts that we undertook in this synthesis was to develop a new disturbance regime layer. And this was a little bit coloring outside the lines in terms of just following what was in the published literature, but we used the published literature a lot in synthesizing this. And so we developed a new disturbance regime layer that we think is a better representation of the variability in the fire history that occurred within the Northwest Forest Plan. The black in the upper left is the classic infrequent high severity fire regimes, where fires burned every several centuries, tended to be higher severity. At the other end, of course, is the ponderosa pine that I mentioned, but there's these two in the middle here that I think bear recognition. And one is in the Western Cascades, for the south part, a somewhat to moderately frequent fire every 50 to 200 years. And that includes a lot of partial stand replacement fire, and sort of creates more of a mosaic of vegetation conditions on the landscape. And then in the drier forests, there's this other mixed severity type. And if you look in the literature these days, particularly some of the debate that goes on between environmentally oriented ecologists, many of whom are in California, and some other, what I consider the larger bulk of the fire scientist community, it's about the proportion of these two. It's sort of like one of these debates about, you know, is this beer less filling or more tasteful? I don't know. But anyway, it's a debate about what's the proportion of mixed severity and low severity in these environments. And we think this map helps us to advance at least where some of those types exist on the landscape. A key outshoot of thinking about fire regimes, thinking about historic range of variability, is what kind of landscapes you might have expected over time. And taking those those four different fire regimes and sort of imagining what the mosaic on the landscape might have looked like, this is what we come up with. So the upper row is the moist forests, and these different blobs here, this is early successional. This might have been a big fire in the Cascades somewhere. But the majority of the landscape would have been either closed old growth or some young, mature condition, and that would have been a slowly shifting mosaic over arbitrarily different time periods. If we move down one notch into somewhat more frequent fire in the west side, we get a more complex mosaic that would have occurred in different seral conditions. This would be something that we often see in parts of the Willamette, the Umpqua National Forest, and parts of the dry forests in the region. And then certainly moving down into the dry forests, we basically flip from the mosaic being a dense multi-layered forest to the matrix being largely open old growth that's punctuated by denser forest conditions that might occur in topographic refugia and other kinds of things. This can be sort of used as a generalized model for what you might imagine a landscape might look like over time, again, changing because of the dynamic nature of the mosaic. It's more than old growth. And so this is these classic successional pathways that we often see related to old growth forests. The one on the top, for example, where there's a fire and centuries go by before you get the multi-layered condition developing this pathway across the upper level here. But of course, we often forget the early successional stages that are important for biodiversity, again, just focusing on the old growth stage. And then there's more than one pathway to get to old growth. The second pathway down from the top, there's a longer period of time before the shade tolerance comes in. You have Douglas fir or the shade intolerant species occupying things for a longer period of time. This third one down has got a lot of hardwoods. You see a lot of that in the coast range where hardwoods occupy the early to mid-successional stages. And so we often, in the coast range, there's often some people want more conifers and they want to push to get the conifers in, push back the shrubs. But in many of these environments, the hardwoods and the shrubby layers were essential to the successional dynamics of it. And then this lower one, of course, represents the one I just talked about, where you've got sort of a initiating stand fire, big fire, but then there's a partial stand replacement fire about parts of the way through. And again, this is something that we often see in the southern part of the Western Cascade. So again, it's more than old growth. It's more than just a single successional pathway. And in developing restoration strategies, I think it's really important to recognize if we can, there's more than one way to do it. And one size does not fit all. Coming up with some diversity of ways to do that, I think is really, really important. Fire suppression. That's a big story for many reasons. And we often think of it as a east side dry forest issue, and of course it is. But we did a little bit of, again, research here, got some new data to present in the synthesis. And we looked at where the fire starts occurred that were suppressed. And so the map on the right shows the fire starts per 25,000 acres, going from just a handful in the light blue to almost 200 fire starts suppressed during this period of time from 92 to 2013. And you can see, of course, not a big surprise, there are a heck of a lot of fire starts in the Southern Cascades and Northern California that didn't go anywhere. Forest Service doing a great job. 98% of the fire starts are suppressed. People never even know they existed because they're just a tree burning or an acre or two. And so in any other business, if you've got a 98%, you'd probably be doing very well. But of course, those 2% that escape are the real challenging ones. But if you look at the story based on the different fire regimes, we can see that there were fire suppression efforts that had effects even in the moisture forests over here. And while those have a different effect than they do in the dry forest, they still affect sort of the mosaic on the landscape. So fire suppression has had effects in both moist and dry forests, which is maybe not something that people appreciate. And we actually got some pushback from some of the reviewers, one of whom I will not name, but is quite familiar to me and is still arguing that fire suppression isn't a big deal on the west side in terms of altering ecosystems. But nevertheless, we've got some pretty good evidence here that it does. And so the ecological effects of fire suppression differ, and that's key because, again, the dry forests are not the same as moist forests. So in the dry forest, fire suppression, of course, we all know this, leads to more dense forests, they're less fire resilient, there's larger patches of high severity fire when they do burn, and there's less early cereal. In the moist forests, that's not the same story because the moist forests are productive, they would have had large fuel loads anyway. Here, the main effect is to reduce the amount of early cereal in the landscape. And while certainly we're not arguing that we should stop fire suppression on the west side because there's lots of reasons that you want to do fire suppression, it does indicate that there's some sort of consequences, some trade-offs, even on the moist side. And that reduces landscape diversity, for example. So the role of history, we had several sections in the synthesis about this. This is very challenging. I know the planning rule has a lot about history. We view history as a guide, but not a target. It's valuable in understanding how climate, disturbance, and succession and species interact. It's really fascinating to see these historical reconstructions, to do paleoecology, because we learn that the past was quite dynamic, and we're just in a new dynamic today. And so it's instead of managing for history, we're really often talking about managing for ecological, quote, ecological resilience to fire, climate change, other factors that we might want to mitigate against. And it's really, rather than managing to restore some conditions, managing more for resilience to some of these stressors. But we also point out that resilience, as you probably all know, is a fuzzy concept. We kind of often move from one fuzzy concept to another. And it's the resilience of what to what. Resilience in itself, just alone, could be good or bad. It's resilient cheatgrass. There's lots of resilient things out there that we work hard to get rid of, and we can't. So just saying we want resilience is really, you got to define your terms. And everyone's definition of what they want to maintain is probably different. And so there's a social dimension. Whose resilience we're talking about here? Challenge for you guys to try to figure that out. Management. We think management is critical, both on the moist side and the east side, whether you have a goal of restoration or resilience or whatever it might be. We put a lot of guidance in here on using thinning, particularly in the west side, variable density thinning. And that's where the Forest Service has actually been pretty successful in carrying that out, particularly in the Coast Range and Sayusla National Forest, for example, where they have almost no matrix land. They basically had to make a living off of restoring plantations, and they've done a very good job. This map on the left illustrates the scope of the problem. This is an LSR. Every green piece is a plantation. For any of you that think LSRs are these big, nice, wild areas without human imprint, this should disabuse you from that, because a lot of these LSRs are full of plantations that are uniform. There's lots of roads. So there's lots of reasons to go in there and shake things up a bit to try to diversify those conditions. And there's been a lot of work on variable density thinning, or relatively a lot of work that shows that taking these uniform areas and thinning them, not the thinning of the 60s and 70s for timber production, but thinning to increase variable conditions across the landscape is the driving force there. Good way to go. Creating early cereal on the west side. This is somewhat controversial because some people see it as just another way to get some logs out. But if we are suppressing fires in these areas, which reduces sort of landscape diversity, then we might want to consider punching some bigger holes in these areas and doing it in a way that actually enhances some of the diversity within these landscapes that are basically grading into closed canopy conditions. And so these are some test examples on the Willamette Forest and some BLM land in southwest Oregon, western Oregon, where those efforts are underway and can create. And so it's been demonstrated that these can be done on the ground. The bigger issue, I think, is the social license and some of the dimensions of that. And then the big challenge, of course, is if we go ahead and plan to do planned early successional, nature often comes along and says, I'm going to put 5,000 lightning strikes down here where you were planning to do early successional cutting next year. I'm going to create 10,000 acres of early successional tomorrow. And so I think planning for this, early successional with fire operating and lightning operating is going to be a real challenge from just a planning standpoint. And then, of course, the dry forest. This is, I think, fairly well established, but we certainly go ahead and talk about what we know about it. That sort of thinning and prescribed fire are key there, promoting large fire-resistant trees, reducing fuel continuity, creating a patchwork of open and closed forests, and using topography as a guide. It's not just anything anywhere. We have a lot of knowledge from fire history that topography really controlled where the denser patches, where the owls were on the landscape. This is true, again, for 40% of the Northwest Forest Plan area is in these drier forests. And we think in many cases we have more old growth, dense old growth, and more owl habitat today than there was historically. And so that helps to put this in context. So in summary, the Northwest Forest Plan stopped logging of old growth. There was still some slight declines. Old growth conservation differs regionally. We need to consider, and we think the historical fire regime map we made might be useful for those of you who need to do some regionalization or planning. New definitions of old growth are needed for dry forests, including the drier parts of the Northwest forest, and they need to include both a stand and landscape. A lot of our definitions of old growth had to do with numbers of big trees per acre, number of dead logs, down logs, etc. But that only tells you what's going on at sort of a patch level. What we really need for these drier forests is some bigger view of what percent of these different successional conditions might be the desired future. So it's not quite a definition, but it provides a landscape context that we don't have now in some of the old growth definitions. Conservation is more than protecting old growth. There's other early successional stages that are important. Ecological history, as I mentioned, is important, but we need to be careful how it's used. And we think that active management for biodiversity and resilience is needed both inside and outside reserves. The reserves, the literature supports quite strongly the idea that ecological reserves may need management for ecological outcomes. And so that's well established in the literature. So there should be no concern about that from a scientific validity standpoint.